So it's important to reflect back and sort of see when and where and why US economic sanctions were imposed and were they successful or not. So if we look back, we can get a good idea if they did work or not. So if you go back to the 1960s, we know that Fidel Castro was aligned with the USSR, and US at the time was not happy with Cuba for Fidel Castro's alignment with the USSR, and US imposed economic sanctions on Cuba in 1960s. But till date, we know that US was not able to convince Cuba to go in their bloc. Cuba was aligned with USSR and is still not an American ally. So in the 60s, economic sanctions the US didn't really work at the time. Then we see that moving ahead, they imposed sanctions on Iraq back in the 90s in the 90s when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and they
That was, I think, the first Gulf War, right?
the
The first.
yes, so that was the initial response of the US that will impose the economic sanctions and push Iraq to pull out of Kuwait. But it wasn't the economic sanctions that really worked. They had to sort of invade Iraq and stop them for going into Kuwait. So at the time, economic sanctions didn't really stop the Gulf War either at the time. And then we saw in the 90s, in the same 97, the US imposed sanctions on Myanmar, Libya, Sudan, all these countries, putting economic sanctions so that they become democratic. Today we know Sudan is not very democratic. Myanmar, we know it's not very democratic. There's a military dictator there, and they imposed sanctions on Belarus, Venezuela in 21st century, early 2000s. Didn't really work. They're still not very democratic. So US tried to put economic sanctions to make these countries democratic, but it kept backfiring. And we'll go into the reasons as to why it backfired. But some prominent economic sanctions that we've all seen in the news and they didn't seem really to work were a we see that US imposed sanctions on North Korea, DPRK, since 50s and 60s when they first started their nuclear program. And they tried to push them towards the nuclear proliferation treaties, tried to prevent them from building their nukes. But what's here? Pyongyang still was able to build nuclear weapons. The strongest economy in the world could not use their strongest economic tool to pressurize the North Koreans. We saw that US put economic sanctions on Russia when it invaded Crimea in 2014.